Hi, everyone. My name is Joe Kelly. I am the Community Relations Program Assistant with the Rochester Hills Public Library. Welcome to this evening's author talk with historian and journalist David Mould, who will discuss his book, Postcards from the Borderlands. Join us on Tuesday, April 13th, that's about 1 week from tonight, at 7 p.m. for another author talk program with Andreas Carlias. I am not 100% sure on that last name, but Andreas Carlias, who will discuss his book, Climate Courage. So to register for that, please visit calendar.rhpl.org. We will leave time for questions at the end of tonight's presentation, but the audience will remain muted throughout. So please feel free to leave any questions in the chat feature, which I will leave a message in after my introduction, just so everyone can see where messages will be popping up and where you can leave them. And when we reach that Q&A, I will be presenting your questions to our presenter to answer. The program will be recorded tonight. It will be available 1 week from tonight. So again, Tuesday, April 13th, it'll be up on RHPL's YouTube page, and you can find it on our website at rhpl.org. Finally, I'd like to thank the Friends of the Rochester Hills Public Library for helping to financially support all of these wonderful programs. So please, for tonight, join me in welcoming our presenter, David Mould. David, take it away.
Okay, thank you, Joe, and thank you to everybody for joining us tonight. Let me just make sure I'm getting the right one here. There we go, I think. All right.
Looks good.
Yep, okay. And I understand it's been a nice day up there in Rochester Hills. It's been a nice day where I live as well. So thank you for sort of giving up on your gardens or whatever else you should be doing at this time of night to join me. The title is The Borders of Our Minds. Borders are something that's fascinated me, I think, all of my life. As you may be able to tell from my accent, I grew up in Britain, and I was lucky enough that my parents took my sister and myself on camping holidays to France and Spain and Italy. And for me, the most exciting part of the trip was crossing borders, not the beach or anything like that. It was going to the France-Spain border or the France-Italy border and seeing the border posts and the guards in their uniforms. But as I, went on to a career, and I had a career as a journalist and then a 30-year academic career, I started to think about borders rather differently. Are they simply political or physical, marked by walls and posts and fences and barriers? Or should we think of them more broadly? Are the borders within countries, borders of language, borders of race, borders of culture? And also other borders in the way that we think about the rest of the world, what I call the borders of our minds. And so this presentation is loosely based on the last chapter of my most recent book, Postcards from the Borderlands, where I kind of try to pull together some of my ideas about borders. So I've been fortunate enough to travel to lots of places over the last 25 years. Of course, I'm very old, so, I've traveled a lot. And most of I've done some tourism, but most of this has been travel for work. I've been fortunate enough to work as a trainer, researcher, consultant, mostly for international agencies, and most recently for the United Nations Children's Fund, UNICEF. So I'm just wrapped up, I guess about a year ago now, a 3-year project in Bangladesh, which took me to that country, I think, 8 times. So in the process, I've crossed a lot of borders in the process of all of this work. And as I travel, I write. And I've always loved to write. And, these things begin as emails to friends and family. I started doing this in the mid-1990s from Central Asia, from Kyrgyzstan, just writing down what I saw, what I observed, the experiences I had, the challenges I had in living and working. And then, after a few years and a bit more research, research, there's a book out of it. So my first book was on Central Asia, Kyrgyzstan, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan. We'll talk a bit about those countries a little later. A region where I worked from the mid-1990s through to about 2012, 2013. More recently, I've been working in the Indian Ocean region. I mentioned Bangladesh, but also India, Madagascar, Indonesia. That brought Monsoon Postcards, and my most recent book, which brings together travel experiences from a lot of other places, Postcards from the Borderlands. So we're going to be traveling tonight to South Asia, first to Africa, then Central Asia, and then South Asia. But let's begin on more familiar ground here in the United States. And before I sort of go any further, I just want to share my travel mantras. I mean, the wonderful Paul Theroux, author of great, great travel books. I wish I could be Paul Theroux. But, talking about the way that he travels and how he kind of manages travels. And then the smartest short sentence on travel writing: travel's only interesting when things go wrong, by Thomas Swift. Like, if you have a perfect trip somewhere, there's nothing worth writing about. Travel is only worth writing about when things go wrong. So we're going to start in the United States here with a question. What are the borders of New York City? You may think you know, but people have imagined different borders. This is, I really can't call it a map, we'll call it a piece of art, by a guy called Daniel Wallingford. 1932 he produced this, and he sold it by mail order. And it pokes fun at the New Yorkers' rather expanded idea of the size and importance of New York City. So Brooklyn's larger than most states in the Union. Manhattan's pretty large as well. And you get down to the Carolina coast, which of course is the lower New York harbor. So it's kind of fun to do this presentation, and people look for their states, because as you move further west, from the state of Philadelphia even, which has capital Pennsylvania, states get all jumbled up. But I mean, it pokes fun at the, New Yorkers' perception. But in fact, there's a lot of research here which shows that people tend to view the borders of their communities, their cities and states, as rather larger than they actually are. People, shall we say, overestimate the size and importance of where they live or places that they know. So we have this great New Yorker cover, which shows that most of the United States could fit into about a city block and a half, and then the rest of the world is just like way, way out there. We know where the center of civilization is. But as I say, there's a lot of research, solid research, social research, which shows that this is the way that people do view their own regions and cities and communities. So we're going to look at a couple of other views of the United States. And I'm going to start with an example from the Soviet Union. So what you're looking at now is a portion of a much larger map that actually sits one floor down from where I'm talking to you tonight at my home in Charleston, West Virginia. This is a part of a Soviet-era schoolroom, middle and high school map of the United States. And I bought this rather large map. It actually cost me more to frame it than to buy it, in Bishkek, the capital of Kyrgyzstan, in 1996 at a bookstore. And I was just interested in it. It was cheap. And I thought, this is quite a nice souvenir to take back. Of course, at the airport, the customs officials tried to confiscate it, claiming this was a valuable cultural artifact. And I had enough rush Russian at that time to argue with them and say, no, it really isn't. This thing hung on schoolroom walls throughout the Soviet Union for decades. It's neither rare nor valuable. So when I got home a couple of years later, as my Russian improved, I started looking at this map in more detail. And basically, it's a historical map covering the period from about 1870 to 1914 and focusing on population, demographics, and economics. And the black symbols there on the legend, Ugol is coal, Neft is oil, Zhelezny Rudy, iron ore deposits. The thing that fascinated me about the map, though, were all of these red flags that were all over it, though mostly in the northeast and the Midwest. What did they represent? Because they were by far the most prominent symbol on the map. And the clue were the dates that went by them, beneath them. They mark the scenes of labor unrest, industrial strife in the United States. And so we have the great railroad strikes, the Homestead strike in Pittsburgh, further west in Colorado, the miners' strike of 1913. So the most prominent symbols on the map were these red flags and the literal translation in the legend Рабочее движение, labor movements. So this was how the history and geography of the United States was being taught to Soviet school children through this kind of ideological lens of labor unrest. And the real borders on this map, I mean, state borders are marked, but the real borders on this map are not political or physical or legal borders. They are class borders between the proletariat, the workers rising up against the capitalist bosses in alliance with the government. So, really, really quite fascinating. Now, you might think that these views of the United States disappeared when the Soviet Union dissolved in 1991. So let me share with you my favorite English version of a pretty widely circulated Russian map of the United States, which shows how the United States is going to split up. This might be a surprise to you, but this was a forecast from a Russian academic and foreign policy wonk, a guy called Igor Panarin, who predicted that economic decline, moral degradation, mass immigration, the usual catalogue of woes, would cause the United States to split up just as the Soviet Union had split up. And I think you could see how attractive this would be to people who were still despairing the breakup of the great Soviet Union, which had held together for 75 years. Very satisfying to think that the evil empire of the United States was going to break up the same way as the Soviet Union broke up. And let's see, in Michigan, you're going to go to become part of Canada. Here in West Virginia, we'll be joining the European Union, which is good news, I guess, because my former country, Britain, just left. Now, I mean, this looks silly, but at the same time, when I was traveling in Central Asia around 2005, 2006, people would come up to me and they would say, when is the United States going to break up? And I'd say, that's silly, it's not going to happen. They said, it has been shown. And they would refer me to the Russian version of this map, which was widely circulated in media and widely reported on. And of course, most of the reports did not mention the caveat that Igor Panarin, its author, had, that the actual risk of disintegration was between 45 and 55%. So this looks silly in a way, but, is it any more silly than some of our views of other parts of the world? So the cartoon on the left from the Philadelphia Inquirer poking fun at some of our stereotypes of Africa. The map on the right is interesting. It's one of a series of maps that's been done, which compiles the most common adjective that Google will autocomplete if you type in the sentence, why is such and such a country so? Why is Nigeria so? Why is Kenya so? Why is South Africa so? Why is Egypt so? So we had a lot of poors, a few hots, a few dangerouses. Again, these stereotypes. So my takeaway from this is that we all kind of construct these mental maps based on various factors, our cultural values, maybe our politics, our experiences as well. But I'm going to argue that some real physical borders actually make no more sense than these crazy mental maps that we have. As an undergraduate back in, I think it was back in the 19th century, it feels like a long time ago now, in Britain, I studied European history from the period from the 16th to the 19th century. And that was a time of constant wars and treaties and countries being formed and dissolved, and territory was always changing hands. It was very, very difficult to keep up with the map of Europe as the Austro-Hungarian Empire and the French and the Spanish and Napoleon, as everybody fought their way around. But when I opened an atlas and I looked at other parts of the world, I started asking other questions. Why are some countries very strangely shaped? And why are there these straight line borders, particularly in the Middle East and Africa? Where did they come from? So the answer is that the straight line borders and a lot of other artificial divisions were made by colonial leaders sitting around conference tables in European capitals, thousands of miles from the lands that they were dividing up. The British, the French, the Belgians, the Portuguese, the Spanish, lesser extent Germany and Italy, each had its own goals, and they carved up the continent of Africa. And this is well illustrated by this quote from the rather stern-looking Lord Salisbury, the British Prime Minister. And he's not in Africa, he's in London with his French counterparts, and they're trying to figure out where to draw the border between the British colony of Nigeria and the French colony of Niger. And as he said, we're just drawing lines on the map. We have no idea where they're going. The borders that were drawn paid no attention to topography, they paid no attention to where ethnic groups lived, they paid no attention to economic activities where herders moved their herds, no regard to any other factors. They were arbitrary lines drawn on the map, and we're living with the consequences of them still. Now, there is a principle in international law that underlies this. I'm going to mangle the Latin here, uti possidetis juris, as you possess under the law. The principle here is that when a colony becomes independent, it's just simpler to make it a new country rather than divide it up into little parts. So this originated in South America in the 19th century when the Spanish Empire was being dissolved. And rather than try to come up with different formulations for countries, it was simpler to say, this colony is Argentina, this one's Venezuela, this one's Peru, this one's Ecuador, this one's Bolivia, etc. The alternative is that on independence you start to divide up the former colony into smaller bits, usually based on where ethnic groups live, sometimes religion. And that's a recipe, of course, for conflict. On the other hand, simply retaining those colonial borders is problematic too. So this is what happened in Africa, or rather what didn't happen in Africa. The map on the left is colonial Africa, the colonial boundaries there. And the map on the right is a current one, but basically not much has changed since the 1960s, when the colonies, the British French Belgian colonies, all became independent. We have South Sudan that we did not have before. But as you see, the borders that are retained, the colonial borders were basically retained in most cases. And so a lot of new countries were created where which brought together many ethnic groups, many languages, different religions. So those artificial lines drawn by Lord Salisbury and other leaders were preserved under this principle of international law in Africa. And that's a recipe for problems, because all African countries contain multiple ethnic groups, and if one ethnic group's in power, another one isn't, and there will be conflicts. So, this is a lot of the roots of conflict in Africa derive from the fact that the colonial boundaries were used to mark the boundaries of the newly independent countries. Could it have turned out differently? This is one of my favorite maps. This is from a Swedish artist, a guy called Nikolaj Sion. And he did a study of the African continent in 1844, before the European powers started carving it up. And basically he looked at ethnic groups and traditional kingdoms. And so there they are. And I don't think you're going to see a straight line border anywhere there. Of course, this is a counterfactual. It didn't turn out this way. And as I mentioned here, that in Islamic cartography, traditionally the south is north and the north is south. But I think it's interesting to speculate on how Africa might have looked if the colonial powers had not come in and sliced and diced it with their straight lines. Would there still have been conflict? Of course there would have been. Maybe it would have been different. We'll see. Okay, I'm going to argue that something rather similar happened when the Soviet Union dissolved in 1991. So I'm going to have to give you kind of 50 years of history in 2 sentences here. From about the 1870s, the armies of Imperial Russia, the armies of the Tsar, advanced east into what today we call Siberia, and southeast into what today we call Central Asia. That's this area on this map identified as the Kazakh, Uzbek, Turkmen, Kyrgyz, and Tajik SSRs, Soviet Socialist Republics. And that's a region where I started working in 1995 and worked for probably 20 years after that in that region. Still have many contacts there. That's Central Asia. After the Bolshevik Revolution and the Civil War and a few random rebellions, the Soviet Union basically inherited the whole Russian Empire. And the Soviets were really worried about 2 things in Central Asia. They were worried about Islam, which was nominally the religion of most of its inhabitants, and they were worried about ethnic groups getting together and rebelling against Soviet rule. So what they did was they gerrymandered borders in the region to make sure that no ethnic group had a majority in a particular area. So they created these Soviet socialist republics, and the way I tell the story, I mean, again, like Lord Salisbury's borders, these are artificial borders. The Kyrgyz and the Kazakhs are very similar. I mean, economically they were both herders. In terms of physical features, they are very similar. The language is almost the same, but the Soviets wanted to divide them up. So the way I tell the story is that some Soviet cartographer in the 1920s stands in a river valley somewhere in the mountains of the Tian Shan, and he points to a shepherd on one hill and he says, "You're a Kazakh," and he points to a shepherd on another hill and says, "And you're a Kyrgyz, and we're going to draw the boundary down here." So administratively, the Soviets tried to keep a lid on potential ethnic unrest by gerrymandering borders in the region. But for many years, I mean, through the life of the Soviet Union, it didn't make a huge amount of difference in the lives of people. Okay, if you lived in the Kazakh SSR, you could cross to the Uzbek SSR to go to the market, to visit relatives, maybe go to university. A little bit more complicated than crossing from Michigan to Ohio, for example, but not much more. But what happened in 1991 is that suddenly these internal borders became national borders, and there were border guards there and barriers and posts, and you couldn't cross the border to go to the market or visit your relatives or travel. So these artificial borders created in the Soviet period, internal boundaries became national boundaries, and that's where problems occurred. This is an area of eastern Uzbekistan and southern Kyrgyzstan called the Fergana Valley. It's an agricultural region. And look at the way the border runs. Uzbekistan is the kind of yellow-green color. Kyrgyzstan is white. It just zigzags in and out and up and down and round about all over the place. And as again I say, this is an attempt to, and there are even two enclaves down there for Uzbekistan, an attempt to keep ethnic groups under control, make sure no ethnic group had a majority in a particular region. Look at the two cities to the east here in Kyrgyzstan, Osh and Jalalabad. They are respectively the second and third largest cities in Kyrgyzstan. Osh has a population of about 300,000, Jalalabad about half that. As you would expect, there's a lot of traffic, a lot of commerce between the second and third largest cities in the country, and they're only 30 miles apart. The problem is that the direct road runs through that little neck of Uzbekistan, and that's where the original borders, the borders of the Soviet Socialist republics, create a problem. When these countries became independent, there were conflicts over land and resources. Kyrgyzstan has water in its mountains that Uzbekistan needs for its cotton fields, for irrigation. Uzbekistan has natural gas that Kyrgyzstan needs to heat apartments and its factories. So periodically the border was closed, or there were problems at the border. The Uzbeks in particular would simply close the border without notice because of something was happening between the countries, and people could not move or not move easily. So, as I say, the direct route, about 30 miles from Osh north to Jalalabad, goes through this place on the border, Karasu. Half of it's in Kyrgyzstan, half of it's in Uzbekistan. And, at one point there was a bridge there and the Uzbeks destroyed it. So much for direct travel. That's been rebuilt. But, periodically the border will be closed, or the Uzbeks will demand visas or transit fees or who knows what else. And so to avoid fines and hassles, a lot of drivers going from Osh to Jalalabad or the other way around go through this little place called Uzgen. It's more than twice as long, takes about 3 times as long to drive because it's a kind of a hilly road, but you get there quicker because you don't get held up at the border. So I always end anything I say about Central Asia with my bipartisan critique of politicians who should know the area a little better. Okay, and another great New Yorker cover, which takes Arabic, Persian, and even a few Yiddish names and imposes them on the 5 boroughs. Again, poking fun at our ignorance of this region. I love the Flatbush Duns and Hyderabad. But I would come back to my university and people would say to me, "Where have you been?" I'd say, "I've been to Kyrgyzstan." And they would say, "Where? Kurdistan?" I said, "No, not Kurdistan. Kurdistan It does not exist as a country, but if it did exist, there's a bit in Syria, a bit in Iraq, and a bit in Turkey, but it's not a country, at least not yet. And they'd say somewhere between China and Iran. I said, well, sort of, yeah. And they would say, oh, there's this Stan and that Stan. I get so confused. You've been in Stanland, which kind of gave me the title for my first book. And actually, it's total nonsense because the word Stan in Persian means land. So literally, I'd been in Landland or Lalaland. Okay, we're going to move on to what I consider to be the most tragic border story of all. And this is the division or the partition of British India in 1947 into Hindu majority India and Muslim majority Pakistan, East and West. So again, to compress the history, British India, the richest and most populous colony in the British Empire, the so-called jewel in the crown, was cobbled together, and I think cobbled together is exactly the verb I want to use, over a period of about 150 years by an organization called the East India Company. The East India Company began, as the name implies, as a trading group, but it quickly developed into a pretty formidable mercenary army. So if you were a traditional ruler, a Maharaja in 19th century India, and you wanted to grab territory from a neighboring state, a neighboring Maharaja, you would call in the mercenaries of the East India Company to do your dirty work for you. And then you would pay them, and then suddenly you would find, oh dear, your traditional kingdom is under quote-unquote British protection. The British will let you do what you want to do within your territory, but in terms of defense and foreign policy, the British decide it. And there's a British advisor sitting at your palace telling you what to do. So gradually the British gain actual or virtual control over the whole subcontinent. Now, it was clear that this could not last. I mean, by the early 20th century, the Indian independence movement was gathering strength, later Mahatma Gandhi, Jinnah, and other leaders. And when we get to World War II, where Britain's resources are exhausted, it becomes very clear that Britain has to let go and figure out a way to give independence to British India. But the question is how? So the map on the right shows broadly what British India looked like in 1947. The pink parts being the princely states and the yellow parts being provinces directly under British control. And unfortunately on the next map the colors are reversed. The yellows are the princely states and the pink parts are the British provinces. But I use this map because there's a circle around Hyderabad. It was by no means ordained that India and Pakistan would be created, because you had all of these princely states. And in 1947, the ruler of Hyderabad, the Nizam of Hyderabad, oops, I went 1, 2, 3, 4, let me back up here. The Nizam of Hyderabad said to the British and to other independence leaders, my state, Hyderabad, should become a constitutional monarchy within the great British Commonwealth. God save King George. He may not have actually said that. But he made the argument, as did other princely rulers, that they were the sovereigns of viable countries. I mean, Hyderabad, the Nizams had ruled for 300 years. Hyderabad had a land area about the size of Britain itself. It had a population of 16 million and an economy the size of Belgium's. It would have made a viable country. There are many countries in the world today that are smaller in size, population and economy than Hyderabad. The problem was that Hyderabad and some other states, princely states here, are large, but there were many small princely states. And if you actually around 565 in total, many too small to show. So if you'd followed that principle that we've talked about, uti possidetis juris, using colonial boundaries here and allowing Hyderabad and allowing other princely states to become independent as, you know, constitutional monarchies or whatever within the British Commonwealth, you would have created almost 600 new countries within British India, which would have been a political, economic, and certainly a cartographic train wreck. So instead, what happened is that each of the provinces and princely states opted to join either India or Pakistan based on the majority religion of its population, Hindu for India, Muslim for Pakistan. The problem came in three areas, and we'll talk about one here and then the others, where there was a mixed population of Hindus and Muslims. So Bengal, I spent a lot of time in Bangladesh recently, so I know the history a little bit here. The British province of Bengal, the British had tried to partition it up in 1905, arguing it was too large to govern effectively. But it was one of these divide and rule policies. They created a Hindu majority West Bengal and a Muslim majority East Bengal. And the Bengalis didn't like this at all. They said, we are much more united by economy and trade and culture and language than we are divided by religion. I mean, Bengal was the scene of the great Bengal Renaissance in the late 19th and early 20th century that produced a Nobel Literature Prize winner. And so the British quickly abandoned this attempt. But when we get to 1947, the borders that are drawn are very, very similar to those that the British had tried to draw in 1905, and now between India and Pakistan. And there were two other areas this is in the east, the two areas in the west, Punjab and Jammu and Kashmir, which also have this, you know, roughly the same numbers of Hindus and Muslims. So the British sent out this guy, his name was Cyril Radcliffe. He had no experience in India, and he was given literally mission impossible. Draw the border between India and Pakistan, and you've got about 2 months to do it. And he had outdated maps and inaccurate census figures. The British were in a real hurry to leave, and when the border was announced in August 1947, it ran through the middle of villages. It sometimes ran through the middle of houses, and a lot of people suddenly found that, you know, they were on the wrong side of the border. They were Hindus in Muslim Pakistan or Muslims in Hindu India, and lots of people tried to move. I mean, we'll never know the extent of really what was religious genocide here on both sides, because a lot of, there were no accurate figures there. But this continues today, communal violence. So using the principle of religion to divide a country here had disastrous and unfortunately long-lasting consequences. So here we have Pakistan. It's two parts, west and east, separated by 1,400 miles of India. What could possibly go wrong with that? Well, they were very different. West Pakistan, was politically and militarily dominant, though it had about the same population as East Pakistan. East Pakistan was taxed and not well represented. They differed in every area apart from in religion, and even a little bit in religion as well. But the real deal breaker here was language. West Pakistan attempted to impose the Urdu language, the language of Islam, on the East. And nobody spoke Urdu in East Pakistan. They spoke Bangla, they spoke Bengali. The Muslims of East Pakistan spoke the same language as their Hindu neighbors in West Bengal, in Calcutta, in India. And eventually, after many years of a simmering resistance movement, there's a 9-month liberation war in 1971, which leads to the independence for Bangladesh. Again, the folly of using religion to draw border lines. And even today, the border looks very, very strange. And I've traveled some of this border here. I mean, it's interesting to actually map it out, because it's almost half as long as the US-Canada border, although the US-Canada border is a straight line, for a very small country about the size of Illinois or Iowa, albeit with a large population. Bangladesh has about 170 million people, plus a bunch of Rohingya refugees, about half the population of the United States. So I'm going to finish here by confessing to my cartographic crimes, and if you feel it is your civic duty to report me to the appropriate authorities, I will go peacefully, okay, and accept my fate. So I have violated both the Criminal Law Amendment Act of India and customs regulations by importing, and worse, actually publishing what the government of India would consider to be incorrect maps of the country. It's a very sensitive issue. Look at the map on the right, and look at the northern part there, where you get this little panhandle of Afghanistan and Tajikistan just to the north. That is one of those provinces, Jammu and Kashmir, which had a divided population, Hindus and Muslims, and a borderline was drawn that gave part of it to Pakistan and part of it to India. But on India maps, official Indian maps, the whole province is shown as being part of India. Except that it's not. Pakistan has about 30% of the territory. There's a bit that China grabbed from India in a war in 1962. But India will never admit that this is not all part of India. There's a heavily militarized line of control. Almost every week there's some little incident between Indian and Pakistani troops on the border, and the two countries have fought 3 wars over this. But again, India wants the world to believe that all of this is part of India. And it gets very sensitive about this. In 2016, the government of India, the government of Narendra Modi, floated a law which would make it punishable. I'm going to read this to you. If you published an incorrect map of India, as I have done, you could face a fine from $150,000 to $15 million, or up to 7 years in jail. Up to 7 years in jail for a bad map seems a little severe. Anyway, after some discussion, the government realized it had gone too far and withdrew it. But it shows the kind of the paranoia India has over how its borders are represented. And then there's Google, okay? And Google, in the interests of doing business everywhere it can do business, shall we say, bows to local political sensibilities. So if you're sitting in India and you pull up a Google map of Jammu and Kashmir, you're going to see the one on the right, which shows the whole province as being part of Mother India. But if you're across the border in Pakistan and you pull up Google Maps, you'll see a rather different view, the one on the left, which shows, the real border, the real line of control. And there's a little bit that's sort of missing out there because nobody's defined what's happening in that little mountain area there. So I guess my takeaway from this is that, is there really any difference between the way in which the government of India and Indian nationalists view their borders, their expanded borders, and the way those New Yorkers view their borders, the size of New York City, maybe not maybe not too much. We all construct these sort of ideal maps of places we know and places we don't know. So I'd like to thank you very much. If you're interested, I do weekly travel blogs, and you just need to pop me an email here, davidhmould@gmail.com. I'd be really interested to have any questions or comments. And if you want to share any interesting crossing border experiences you've had where you were hit up for bribes, or maybe you were detained, I don't know, that would be great. So I'm going to stop the share here, and I guess we'll sort of open the mics and see if we've got anything in the chat. Yeah.
All right. Hi, everyone. That was a wonderful presentation, David. I really found that really interesting.
Well, I had fun doing it. Thank you. I think you can tell, and the book's the same. I kind of write the way that I talk. It's quite informal. Yeah.
Well, we're waiting for some people to pop in some questions in the chat, but I wrote a couple down because I was having a few questions of my own during this program.
And we can just open microphones if people want to ask them directly. That's fine. I don't think we'll have an issue here.
I will pop that up.
Yeah.
All right, folks will be allowed to unmute if they would like to. Just give me a heads up if you'd like to share, and we can give you a moment to talk.
He's a library cop, isn't he? Controlling access.
All right. We have a question from Anne just makes a comment. It's just a really great presentation, and she was a map geek. Could sit for hours with an atlas.
Oh, absolutely. And I would agree with you. I mean, I think you look at an atlas, and every time you look at a country or look at a border, I mean, this is one thing I perhaps should have said. Every time you look at a border, think about how it came that way, because there are very few natural borders in the world. But yeah, I'm the same. I look at place names. How did it get that place name? What was it called before? What's this? What's that? Yeah, I mean, reading maps. And we talk about reading maps, being able to interpret where we're going. But I think maps by themselves are so absolutely fascinating. Every time I walk up the stairs and look at my big Soviet map, I discover something different in it. Yeah. Yay for map geeks.
My straight line border story is I served in Korea, and the demilitarized zone along the 38th parallel was drawn by two colonels who had a National Geographic map, and they were under a time deadline, and that's why it exists. It didn't follow the natural boundary, which would have been the Indian River. Mm-hmm. And we're stuck with it today, 70 years later.
They just drew a straight line with a natural.
I had a ruler.
Yeah.
What are we going to do? It just drew it.
Yeah, I mean rather like the story in India. Faced with a deadline, faced with a timeline, people on the ground have to do what they have to do. But we then, for generations, live with the consequences of that, very, very hasty border drawing. Yeah.
Thank you for that comment, Don. That was great. Sorry. I wondered, because you mentioned before about looking at the map and seeing these borders, wondering how they got there. I'm curious, is there any border that you can recall in your immediate memory, or perhaps one of the more bizarre or just absurd borders where you just see it on the map and you're like, how did they draw this?
Well, I think I started to tell this story already. I worked in Kyrgyzstan from 1995, 4 years after the fall of the Soviet Union. I was working in that area. I showed you the Fergana Valley, and it was like, whew, why did the border become this way? Because it snaked in and it snaked out, and the border kept changing as well. I remember, it was always very tricky to travel because you never quite knew where the border posts would be. Sometimes the Uzbeks moved their border posts. I mean, they moved them from a field onto the road. If you put your border posts on the road, you stop drivers, and then you can then start hitting them up. And I remember going through one place I was being driven, and we're coming into this little village, and the driver swerves off to the right, and we sort of drive up this sort of dirt road up into the mountains and then cross the stream and come down the other side. And he did that simply because he didn't want, it was like 100, maybe less, 50 yards of Uzbekistan he didn't want it to go through. So yeah, I think there's some crazy things. The other crazy thing I think are territorial enclaves. I didn't have time to get into this tonight, but these are little portions of one country's territory surrounded by another country's territory. And in fact, Bangladesh and India had a lot of those. And those are kind of they make least sense. I mean, there was one. They did a land swap in 2015 that eliminated, I think, all but one. But I mean, one case, there was, I think, like a part of a village, an Indian village, surrounded by a part of Bangladesh, surrounded by India in Bangladesh proper. So it's like, I mean, why? This makes no sense. But I mean, think about the lives of the people in these places. If you've got to cross a border, do you have a passport or not? Do you have papers? I mean, essentially, some people were kind of left stateless by that. So yeah, it's those little geographical oddities that I think that they interest me most, but also frustrate me. Yeah,
it's fascinating, the concept that you could really in that way be in this sort of like diaspora within your own country.
Yeah, absolutely.
Borders.
Yeah,
fascinating. I waiting on any other questions, or if anybody wants to, feel free to do so. I was curious if you had any similar stories about borders, whether in regards to like the United States, whether it comes from the colonial European powers before the revolution, or even the colonial movements afterwards on Native American land.
I'm going to defer. That I've lived long enough not to speak on something that I know not enough about. Okay, yeah. Actually, there's a very good, I think, PBS series called. It's called something like The Shape of the States, or How the States Were Shaped. I don't know. You could look it up, but I mean, they deal with the Michigan-Ohio border, Toledo and stuff like that.
Toledo. I had just found out about that recently.
Yeah, that's it. Yeah, but so I'm not going to. I'm really not going to try to offer any. Less than well-informed opinions on that topic. Okay.
If I could add something along that line, the border between Canada and the United States, going from Minnesota all the way out to Washington, has several spots like that where you can only get to your own country by going through the other country to get to your country again.
Right.
And they have customs and borders and all of that.
Yeah, there was a piece I think somebody pointed out to me on CBS Sunday Morning recently, a profile of, I'm just trying to think, it's out in the state of Washington, but there's this sort of little bit of Washington, part of a peninsula, which is cut by the borders. And I mean, basically, it's not like it's been totally isolated, but the closing of the border because of the pandemic has created huge disruption and economic problems there. So yeah, it's normally the US-Canada border isn't a problem, but it's been a problem the last few months, certainly. Yeah.
But things like that exist all over the world, and you're the world traveler.
Oh yeah.
This is not particular to North America.
No, absolutely not. No, it's yeah. So yeah, there were these little these little geographical oddities everywhere. But again, you're right. It's where somebody's drawn a straight line, and or an arbitrary line, and without regard, as in the career example, without regard to, mountain ranges or rivers or any natural features there that create these problems. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much for that. Oh, and just an update on that special you mentioned, that is called the How the States Got Their Shapes.
There we go. Thank you. Well, good quick research from a librarian there. Yeah.
I have that book.
Oh, good.
Yeah.
Good. Yeah. No, that's on my reading list. I think there's a PBS series as well that was based on it. But yeah.
Mark Stein wrote the book.
Okay, great.
Any more questions from anyone in the audience here? Nothing yet.
Okay. Well, it's close to 8 o'clock now, and if there are no more questions, I'd just really like to thank everybody for joining me tonight. As you can tell, I kind of have fun with this, and thank you for the Rochester Hills Public Library and to Kelly for hosting this. And let me wish everybody well, and hope that you can all travel again soon. Okay, that's what I look forward to. I've been kind of down the last year not being able to travel, but maybe soon. As I say, I have an extreme case of cabin fever, but that's better than having the virus.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you for that fantastic program. It was a really fun watch, and thank you all for joining us tonight. We hope you'll join us again for our next author talk next week, and we are all very grateful you've all taken the time to join us for this great presentation. I hope you'll all look forward to maybe sharing it with some friends or family members once we have it online next week. So thanks again, everyone, for joining us. And one more thank you to David Mould for this awesome program. I'm going to go ahead and say goodnight to everybody. So thanks for joining us.
Thanks very much, everybody. Good night. Stay safe.
Stay safe. Good night.